The Prime Minister was up in Aberdeen yesterday, and then
Yeah, he was
hurtled
here.
his way. He hurtled his way back down to London to deliver this speech, and then it didn't really quite have. It was, if I was being unkind, I would compare it a little bit to that kind of late era Theresa May, where she would call these press conferences, call these statements, and give lots of rhetoric, but not actually move the dial very much in terms of what she said. And I did feel a little bit like that from Rishi Sunak in that he wanted to
But
say something. He had a lot to say, but he didn't really have a lot of kind of detail in order to pepper it with.
the UK must face down extremists, quote, who would tear us apart. The Prime Minister's warning that the war in Gaza has led to what he calls a shocking increase in intimidation and threats on the streets.
We are a country where we love our neighbours and we are building Britain together. But I fear that our great achievement in building the world's most successful multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy is being deliberately undermined. There are forces here at home trying to tear us apart. Since October the 7th, there have been those trying to take advantage of the very human angst that we all feel about the terrible suffering that war brings to the innocent, to women and children, to advance a divisive, hateful ideological agenda. On too many occasions recently, our streets have been hijacked by small groups who are hostile to our values and have no respect for our democratic traditions.
Well, that's Rishi Sunak speaking in Downing Street last night. We're joined by Alain Tolhurst, who's chief reporter at Politics Home. Alan, good morning.
Morning, Callum.
Really good to speak to you. Right then, so on this address from the Prime Minister, he announced a crackdown on extremism. And this seems to have been prompted by, I suppose, a number of things, a bit of a build-up over the last 10 days particularly. But perhaps
Yeah.
the tipping point was George Galloway's victory in the Rochdale by-election. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so, which also came with a lot of criticism of the way that that campaign was run and suggestions from various other parties that there had been intimidatory tactics used and a lot of kind of, you know, it wasn't exactly politics at its best and the kind of quite toxic way that the campaign was run, I think has partly prompted it. But as you say, it's been bubbling since ever that we've had these protests every sort of Saturday, the sort of pro-Palestine protests in the last few months, and then also the stuff around the debate in Parliament last week on the ceasefire, and I think that has all kind of contributed towards it.
Yeah. In terms of what the Prime Minister said then, so obviously kind of strong language, as in rhetoric, and kind of really hitting those sweet spots as well. But he also said the government will be publishing a new robust framework on dealing with protest. Do we know what that means? What will that involve?
No, and we don't. And as you say, it was kind of an extraordinary thing to do. He's certainly got some hearts aflutter a bit when you start to announce a press conference at 5:40 p.m. in Downing Street on a Friday after a by-election. Then people's brains start to go worrying about the potential election and that sort of stuff. And but the fact that he used what essentially is the most kind of high-powered vehicle with which to deliver his message, giving a speech outside Downing Street with with the press there, shows how important it feels it is. It did feel a little bit like, if not rushed, certainly they have not thought all the way through. There was nothing concrete really to put behind it. And you, as you say, this robust framework that he talked about, there hasn't really been evidence of what it actually looks like. And so clearly it's something that they've been thinking about and working on with the Home Secretary and stuff in the past few weeks. But it hasn't actually come to fruition yet. And it did feel a little bit like, the Prime Minister was up in Aberdeen yesterday, and then
Yeah, he was
hurtled
here.
his way he hurtled his way back down to London to deliver this speech, and then it didn't really quite have. It was, if I was being unkind, I would compare it a little bit to that kind of late era Theresa May, where she would call these press conferences, call these statements, and give lots of rhetoric, but not actually move the dial very much in terms of what she said. And I did feel a little bit like that from Rishi Sunak in that he wanted to
But
say something, he had a lot to say, but he didn't really have a lot of kind of detail in order to pepper it with.
sure, but I suppose the thing on that, Alan, is most of it, most people will agree with. Is that fair to say? There will be a feeling of agreement with what Rishi Sunak had to say. We need to defend democracy from being deliberately undermined. We'll deliver this robust framework. I mean, there's any number of pithy quotes that are picked up in the papers today. He implores the nation to banish hatred from our streets, intimidation, threats, plans, act of violence. I mean, there's a lot in there that people will say, do you know what? I'm actually on board with that.
Yeah, I do think you're right. And I think that a lot of people have seen what's happened over the past few months, as I say, with the marches that we see in most cities on a Saturday, and the kind of, they're very overwhelmingly peaceful, but there is elements of it which are intimidatory, and there are obviously incidents like people turning up outside the MP to buy Selwood's house, and you're speaking to him later, that sort of stuff, and think that that's not really right. That's not on. We know the kind of the threats that are made towards MPs, that sort of stuff, and the threats that are made towards people in public life, and people do want to see that sorted out, and so therefore, yeah, he will have struck a chord with what he said. I just feel that, from a sort of policy standpoint, it
Mm.
was largely rhetoric rather than policy.
Yeah, I get you, and it's really fascinating seeing the messages coming in this morning. So drop us a WhatsApp, 0333 003 2353 to have your say on what Rishi Sunak had to say, the tone of it, the content of it. I want to ask Alan then as well about George Galloway. We've mentioned him
Yeah.
already. Of course, we were reflecting the by-election result yesterday, but I want to consider this in light of what it does, or indeed doesn't do, to Labour. The Times reports this morning a Labour source calling for Keir Starmer to take a stronger line on Gaza. Here's the quote: Keir seems to have no fixed beliefs on so much, but on Gaza he's been totally unwavering, and that's a frustration for those of us who think there is a space to be more vocal on an issue that has always been core for Labour. Now, that source clearly unnamed, but it's interesting because that is a direct reaction to the election of George Galloway as an MP.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what George Galloway would have wanted. George Galloway would have opened his copy of His Majesty's Times this morning and been very pleased about reading a quote like that, because clearly he wants to be an irritant. He wants to be difficult and make things difficult for Keir Starmer. It's interesting that I know he criticised Rishi Sunak after his speech, but largely his attacks have been on the Labour Party, has been attacks on Keir Starmer. And, he knows he's got a limited amount of time in Parliament. It's probably going to be 6 months or so before there's a general election and he has to fight that seat again. He wants to cause as much difficulty as possible, and he wants to, I'm sure he'll get up, he'll be sworn in on Monday, he'll use the first potential opportunity to speak in the chamber, he'll talk about Gaza, and he'll attack the Labour Party. I think, for the Labour Party, they've got to be careful about reading too much into it. We know that there's a problem with reading too much into by-election necessarily, and
Mm.
this one doesn't really have any sort of read across to a larger general election because the circumstances were so specific. Having a candidate who they disavowed, having George Galloway there. So I think that there's a chance that they maybe go a little bit kind of overboard and using this as a springboard to change their policy. I think hopefully there'll be voices within Lotto that say, actually, let's not do that. This is an aberration, kind of bizarre set of circumstances, and that actually our policy has been, consistent, and actually maybe people want a bit of consistency in terms of what's being said.